She was the kind of student who could almost disappear in a room full of people. Not because she was trying to hide, but because the world seemed too loud and too fast, and she moved at her own quiet pace. Her classmates noticed her only when she had to be noticed, like when the teacher called on her to answer a question. Even then, her answers were short, careful, and polite, as if she was always thinking 3 steps ahead. No one really knew much about her. She didn't complain, she didn't brag, and she never asked for attention. She carried herself like someone carrying a secret she wasn't quite ready to share. Her name didn't matter much to the other students. She wasn't the kind of person people whispered about in the hallways. She didn't wear flashy clothes, didn't have loud friends, and didn't participate in the gossip that often dominated a middle school. Instead, she spent her days quietly, moving from class to class with her books hugged close to her chest, a small backpack resting lightly on her shoulders. To someone who didn't pay attention, she was just another student, nothing extraordinary. Nothing remarkable. But in the music room, everything changed. That morning, the music teachers noticed her sitting at the back of the room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't rush to get the best seat, didn't try to sit near the piano or the other instruments that were carefully lined up along the walls. She just picked a corner where she could quietly observe without being in the way. The room itself was buzzing with activity students practicing scales, adjusting their sheet music, laughing quietly, some humming under their breath, but she didn't join in. She just watched, her eyes following the movements of everyone else, taking it all in. The teachers, both experienced musicians themselves, exchanged glances. They had seen many students come and go over the years, and most of them were eager to show off their skills. But this girl, the one who barely spoke, who never volunteered for anything, who seemed so small and cautious, intrigued them. There was something about the way she held herself, a quiet confidence that was easy to overlook but impossible to ignore once you paid attention. "Would you like to join the advanced music group?" One of the teachers asked casually that day, as if it were just a normal question. The girl looked up, her eyes wide but calm. She hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and measured, like she was testing the waters. "Yes," she said, almost like a whisper. The teachers exchanged a subtle look. Advanced music group wasn't for beginners. It wasn't even for students who were just good at reading notes or keeping a rhythm. It was for students who could interpret music, feel it, and bring it to life. They had prepared challenging pieces for auditions, and they didn't expect much from a student who had never shown any sign of musical ambition, but there was something in her gaze that made them pause. It wasn't arrogance and it wasn't desperation, it was focus. It was as if she had waited her whole life for this moment without realizing it. Something told them that this quiet, unassuming girl might just surprise them. They handed her the sheet music. It was intimidating. A classical piece, known for its technical difficulty and emotional depth, usually attempted only by students twice her age. The teachers didn't expect her to play it perfectly, most wouldn't, but they wanted to see if she could rise to the challenge. Even just a little, she took the sheet music in her hands, her fingers brushing the notes lightly as if she were touching something precious. She didn't speak. She didn't frown or smile. She just nodded once, small and deliberate, and tucked the music under her arm. She didn't even glance at the other students who were watching her with curiosity and mild amusement. To them, it seemed like a quiet girl had just agreed to do something she had no hope of achieving, but at home, things were different. When she closed the door behind her, the quiet disappeared. In the small apartment she shared with her mother, the walls echoed with the sound of a worn-out keyboard, a chair scraping against the floor, and the soft murmur of concentration. The room was cramped, with barely enough space to stretch out her arms, but she didn't seem to mind. She set the sheet music down carefully, opened it to the first page, and began to play. At first, it wasn't perfect. Her fingers stumbled over a few notes, her wrist ached, and she had to pause several times to get her bearings. But there was determination in her movements, a relentless drive that didn't falter even when things got difficult. She had done this before, not like this. Not this particular piece, but she knew what it meant to pour yourself into music and let it flow. Hours passed unnoticed. The world outside her small apartment might as well have disappeared. The only thing that mattered was the sound, the rhythm, the story that unfolded under her fingertips. Music wasn't just a hobby for her, it was memory, comfort, and connection all at once. It reminded her of her grandfather, who had taught her everything he knew before he passed away. He had been her first teacher, her mentor, and in many ways her anchor. When the apartment got too quiet, when the world felt too heavy, she would close her eyes and imagine him sitting beside her, guiding her hands, nodding with approval. The music wasn't just notes on a page. It was a conversation with someone she loved deeply and had lost far too soon. Her mother noticed the change too. She worked long hours at a job that barely paid the bills, and she worried constantly about the future. But she also noticed the way her daughter's eyes lit up when she played, how the tension in her shoulders disappeared, and how the apartment, despite its small size and clutter, seemed brighter when she sat at that old keyboard. She never interrupted, never commented, but she made sure the room stayed quiet, giving her daughter the space she needed to practice and dream. Back at school, the days passed slowly. Other students whispered about the quiet girl who had agreed to attempt the advanced piece. Some thought she would fail. Some thought it would be entertaining to watch. The teachers, meanwhile, watched her silently, curious but cautious. They had set an impossible challenge, one they assumed no one could meet. And yet there was a spark in her that made them reconsider their expectations. Every time she returned to the music room, she seemed to carry a new confidence, subtle but noticeable. Her posture straightened, her hands moved with more assurance, and her eyes no longer darted nervously around the room. She was learning to claim her space, not with loud words or gestures, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew she belonged. No one else could see it yet. But her heart was preparing for the moment when she would finally prove herself, the moment when the world would stop and listen. And she knew that when that moment came, it wouldn't be about impressing anyone, it would be about honoring the music, honoring her grandfather, and honoring herself. By the end of the week, the teachers were already talking quietly to each other about her progress. They hadn't heard a note yet, but there was something in the way she approached the music, in the way she held herself in the room, that hinted at hidden talent. They didn't know how far she could go, and that uncertainty made the anticipation almost unbearable. She, on the other hand, wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. She was thinking about playing, about feeling the notes beneath her fingers, about letting the music tell its story. And when the day of the audition finally arrived, she would be ready, not because she wanted to prove anyone wrong, but because she had prepared every ounce of herself for this one moment. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't luck. It was preparation, patience, and a quiet strength that no one had noticed until now. And as she walked into the music room that morning, sheet music clutched in her hands, the teachers looked at her in a new light. She was still quiet, still unassuming, but there was an intensity in her gaze that made them pause. They didn't know it yet, but the impossible challenge they had set for her was about to be met in a way they would never forget. And for the first time, the quiet girl who had always stayed in the shadows was about to step into the light. When the music teachers handed her the sheet music for the audition, they expected her to hesitate. They had chosen a piece so difficult that most students would have laughed, argued, or walked away. It was the kind of challenge that separated the talented from the truly extraordinary. To them, it was a test, a way to see if this quiet girl was ready for the advanced group, or if she would quietly fail like most others. She took the music home without a word. Her fingers traced the notes softly, almost as if she were studying them with her eyes rather than her hands. The piece was intimidating, filled with complex rhythms, unexpected pauses, and intricate melodies that required precision and emotion at the same time. Even seasoned students struggled with it, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at it with a strange mixture of respect and determination, like a runner staring at a finish line that seemed impossible to reach but promising if conquered. At home, she set up her little keyboard in the corner of the living room. It was old, keys slightly sticky, and the sound not nearly as clear as a real piano, but it was all she had. She spread the sheet music on the stand, took a deep breath, and began. At first, her hands stumbled. The notes that seemed easy in theory refused to cooperate in practice. Her wrist ached, her fingers fumbled, and she sighed quietly when she hit wrong keys. But she didn't give up. Every wrong note was a lesson. Every pause was an opportunity to adjust. Slowly, the music began to make sense under her fingers. She didn't just play the notes, she felt them. She understood the story behind them, the emotions hidden between each measure. To her, music wasn't just about playing correctly. It was about speaking without words, about saying everything you couldn't say out loud. She had spent years learning this secret from her grandfather, who had always told her, "Play with your heart, and people will hear it, even if they don't see you." Days passed, each one blending into the next. She practiced for hours, sometimes losing track of time completely. The small apartment, usually quiet and dim, was filled with the sound of her music. Her mother would occasionally peek in, tired from her long shifts, but she never interrupted. She understood somehow that this music was more than just practice, it was a lifeline, a connection to something bigger than both of them. Her determination grew. Not just because she wanted to succeed, but because she had something to prove to herself. She wasn't trying to show off for the teachers or the students. She wasn't playing for applause or recognition. She was playing because it was a part of her that had been buried for too long, a part that her grandfather had nurtured and that she refused to lose. Each day, each practice session, each careful adjustment of her fingers brought her closer to the music that lived inside her. Even the challenges that seemed impossible became small obstacles she could overcome. The rhythms that made her hands shake at first gradually became second nature. The jumps between notes that had once felt like giant leaps now flowed smoothly. She began to add her own subtle touches, little improvisations that weren't on the sheet but felt natural. It was as if the music itself was teaching her, guiding her, telling her where she needed to go. Her confidence started to grow, though she kept it quiet. At school, she still sat at the back of the music room, watching others practice and keeping to herself. But there was a new light in her eyes, a quiet readiness that hadn't been there before. The teachers noticed, though they didn't say anything yet. There was a sense of anticipation building around her, though no one could quite explain why. Even the other students began to whisper, though carefully, about the girl who seemed so ordinary but was suddenly acting different. One evening, while she practiced alone, she paused to stretch her fingers and looked at the worn-out keys. Her mind wandered back to her grandfather. She could almost hear his voice. Music comes from inside. It doesn't matter if the piano is perfect or the room is small. What matters is the heart behind it. She smiled softly. He had always known she could do more than she believed, and now, for the first time in a long while, she felt she could finally live up to that belief. Her mother noticed the change, too. She wasn't sure what exactly had shifted. Maybe it was the way her daughter moved with purpose, or the way she hummed softly even when no one was listening, but it was clear that something important was happening. She didn't say much, just made sure the apartment stayed quiet when her daughter was practicing, and that she had a little time to herself before bed. It was a small gesture, but it mattered more than words could express. At school, the day of the challenge began to feel closer and closer. The other students speculated about whether she would be able to play the piece at all. Some thought she would fail. Some, more curious, thought she might surprise everyone. But she didn't think about them. She focused on the music, on her own preparation, on making every note count. She knew that fear or doubt wouldn't help her succeed. Only practice, patience, and belief in herself could get her through. One afternoon, as she was practicing, her younger neighbor stopped by to watch. He had always been fascinated by her music, but never dared to speak up. Now, he lingered at the door, eyes wide, listening. She didn't notice him at first. She was too absorbed in the piece. But when she finished a particularly difficult passage flawlessly, she looked up and smiled softly. It was a small smile, full of quiet pride, but it was enough to make the boy clap quietly. She nodded back, a little embarrassed, and returned to her practice. She wasn't playing for applause, but in that moment she realized that the music had power beyond her own hands. It could touch others, even when she wasn't trying. Every day she played, She felt the impossible challenge becoming less intimidating. The piece that had seemed so overwhelming at first now felt like a conversation between her fingers and the piano, between her heart and the notes on the page. She knew that she still had a long way to go, but she also knew that she was ready to face the audition. She had worked harder than ever before, not because anyone demanded it, but because she wanted to be ready for herself, for the music, and for the memory of her grandfather who had given her this gift. Her teachers were watching quietly from afar. They had expected a nervous student, maybe a shaky performance, perhaps even someone who would struggle to finish the piece. But they began to notice something unusual. Her focus, her determination, the way she approached each measure, it was different. There was something in her that couldn't be taught, couldn't be coached, and couldn't be faked. They whispered among themselves, exchanging glances of disbelief. Perhaps this quiet, unassuming girl was more prepared than they had imagined. The night before the audition, she practiced later than usual. The apartment was dark except for a single lamp over the keyboard. She played each section carefully, slowly, and then faster, building speed and precision. She didn't feel tired. She didn't feel nervous. She only felt the music, the rhythm flowing through her hands, the notes vibrating in the quiet room. When she finally paused, she leaned back and took a deep breath. For the first time, she felt ready. It wasn't just about hitting the right notes anymore. It was about expression, about telling a story without words, about carrying the music beyond herself. She had spent days, maybe weeks, preparing not just to play, but to perform. And although no one else in the world could hear it right now, she felt a quiet certainty that when the time came, the music would speak for her. She tucked the sheet music safely into her folder and sat back, letting the silence fill the room. For a moment, she closed her eyes and pictured the music room at school, the teachers waiting, the other students watching. She felt a mixture of calm and excitement. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to show what she had learned, to let the notes tell the story she had been carrying all along. The impossible challenge that had seemed so daunting now felt like an opportunity, a chance to step forward and reveal a part of herself that had long been hidden. She wasn't playing to prove anyone wrong. She wasn't playing to impress. She was playing because she could, because she had prepared, and because the music had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. And as she finally closed her eyes and rested, her hands on the keyboard, she knew that tomorrow would be the beginning of something new, not just in the music room, but in her own life. She had faced the impossible challenge in private, in her small apartment, with nothing but determination and heart. Now, she was ready to face it in front of the world. The quiet girl who had always stayed in the shadows had begun her journey. The impossible challenge wasn't just a test of skill, it was a test of courage, patience, and belief in herself. And she had passed it in the only way that mattered, by preparing, by practicing, and by letting her heart guide her hands. When she finally turned off the lamp and climbed into bed, she didn't feel nervous. She didn't feel afraid. She felt ready, calm, and quietly confident. The next day, she would step into the music room, take her place, and show everyone something they would never forget. The moment she stepped into the music room that day, her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with memory. The sheet music in her folder felt heavier than usual, not because of its weight, but because it carried more than just notes. It carried echoes of the past, whispers of lessons long gone, and the quiet presence of someone who had once been her anchor in a world that often felt too big and too loud. She remembered the afternoons in her grandfather's music room, a small sunlit space filled with the warm smell of old wood and polished instruments. The walls were lined with shelves of sheet music, some so old the paper had yellowed with age. Every surface held memories, photos of performers, little trophies from recitals, and scraps of paper where he had scribbled advice and encouragement. That room had been her sanctuary, a place where the outside world didn't exist, where nothing else mattered but the music and the bond she shared with him. Her grandfather had been more than a teacher. He had been patient, kind, and strict in the ways that mattered most. He never shouted or demanded attention. Instead, He guided her gently, listening to her mistakes and showing her the right way without ever taking away her joy. He had taught her that music was more than just notes on a page. It was emotion, expression, and connection. He had always said, "When you play, tell your story. Let your hands speak what words cannot." She had absorbed every lesson he offered, not realizing at the time how much of it would shape her life. But then he passed away suddenly, and the world had shifted. Music became quieter, her practice sporadic, and the small joy that had always filled her afternoons seemed to dim. Life had become a struggle between responsibilities, school, and the reality of a world without him. For years, she had tucked her talent away, hidden it in the corners of her mind, and tried to blend in, just another student among many, and yet, even after all that time, the music never truly left her. It lived in her hands, in the way her fingers instinctively remembered patterns, in the way her mind could anticipate rhythms before they even arrived. It was dormant, waiting for the moment it could be awakened, and now, with the sheet music for the audition in her hands, that moment had arrived. As she set up the keyboard at home, she felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation. Every note she played reminded her of him, the corrections he had gently offered, the small smiles he had given when she played something particularly well, the quiet way he had encouraged her to find her own voice in every piece. She realized that she wasn't just practicing for a teacher or an audition. She was practicing to honor him, to keep his memory alive in every sound she made. She began slowly, carefully, letting each note resonate, feeling the rhythm move through her fingers. The piece was demanding, testing her technical skills and her ability to convey emotion simultaneously. But she remembered his words, his voice in her mind. Feel the music. Let it flow through you. Don't just play it, live it. And with that thought, her hesitation melted. She was no longer simply trying to master the notes. She was telling a story, one that had been inside her for years, waiting for the right moment to come out. As the days passed, she became absorbed not just in the mechanics of the music, but in the emotion behind it. She remembered the afternoons when her grandfather would hum a melody softly while she practiced, guiding her to understand the subtle shifts in tone and tempo. He had taught her to listen not just to the notes, but to the spaces between them, the pauses that carried as much weight as the music itself. Now, she applied those lessons with careful attention, practicing not just to play correctly, but to speak through her instrument. Sometimes memories overwhelmed her. She would pause, closing her eyes and picturing his familiar smile, the gentle way he had guided her hands, the pride he had shown when she succeeded. Music had been their connection, their language, and even though he was gone, the connection remained alive in every note she played. It was comforting, grounding, and motivating all at once. It reminded her why she had persisted through the quiet years when she had felt lost, why she had kept returning to the keyboard despite the challenges, and why this audition mattered more than just being accepted into the advanced group. Her mother noticed these moments too. She had always been quietly supportive, but now she seemed to understand the depth of what her daughter was experiencing. She didn't ask questions, didn't interrupt. She simply allowed the space to exist, knowing that some things couldn't be explained in words. She watched her daughter grow through this process, seeing the confidence build in small, subtle ways, the way she straightened her back when practicing, the way her hands moved with increasing precision, the way her focus never wavered. It was as if music had become the bridge between the girl she was and the person she was becoming. School offered no distractions from this process. The other students were absorbed in their own routines, unaware of the internal transformation taking place. She still sat quietly at the back of the music room, her eyes occasionally flicking to the teachers who watched her with quiet curiosity. They had assigned the impossible piece, thinking it would be too difficult. But they were beginning to notice something remarkable: her focus, her calm determination, and the subtle ways she interpreted the music. They whispered quietly to each other, exchanging surprised looks. Realizing that this girl was not only meeting the challenge, they might have underestimated her entirely. One afternoon, she took a break from practicing and wandered through the living room, glancing at old photographs of her grandfather. She noticed the faint smile on his face in one picture, holding a violin that looked far too big for his hands. A wave of emotion washed over her, not sadness alone, but a quiet gratitude for having known him, for having been taught by someone who believed in her unconditionally. She realized that every moment spent practicing, every stumble and correction, every note learned was a continuation of what he had started. Music was no longer just her talent, it was her inheritance, her responsibility, and her connection to the past. With renewed determination, she returned to the keyboard, her fingers moving more confidently across the keys. She began to experiment with the piece, adding small embellishments that weren't on the sheet music but felt right to her, subtle touches that expressed her own voice. She was no longer just following instructions. She was interpreting, creating, and breathing life into the music in a way that only someone with deep understanding and personal connection could. Each session became a blend of technical practice and emotional storytelling, a preparation not just for the audition, but for the moment when she could truly express herself. Her practice sessions grew longer, more intense but also more joyful. She discovered the satisfaction of mastering difficult passages, the thrill of hearing the music come together, and the quiet pride of knowing she was doing something meaningful. The apartment, once quiet and mundane, now rang with energy and purpose. Even her mother could feel it, sensing that this wasn't just preparation for school, it was preparation for life, for something bigger than herself, something that demanded courage and devotion. As the audition day approached, she began to visualize herself in the music room at school. She imagined the teachers watching, the other students whispering, the nervous anticipation in the air. But she didn't feel intimidated. She felt ready, strengthened by the memories of her grandfather, by the countless hours she had invested, and by the knowledge that she had poured her heart into this moment. This was her chance, not just to perform, but to honor everything that had brought her here, and she knew, deep down, that her preparation had been about more than just playing notes correctly. It had been about understanding the soul of the music, about connecting with something beyond herself, and about carrying forward a legacy she had inherited from the person who had believed in her first. Every mistake she had corrected, every pause she had observed, every subtle change she had added to the piece was now part of her identity, a reflection of the dedication and love that had been passed down to her. That night, she placed the sheet music carefully on the stand, turned off the lamp, and sat quietly for a few moments, letting the silence settle over her. She thought of her grandfather, of the lessons, the encouragement, and the belief he had instilled in her. She felt a quiet resolve forming inside her, a promise to herself that she would play with everything she had, not just for the teachers, not just for the audition, but for the music itself and for the person who had taught her to love it so deeply. She closed her eyes, imagining the room at school, the faces of the teachers, and the notes that would soon fill the air. She felt her fingers move even when they weren't on the keys, anticipating the flow of the music, the rise and fall of the melody, and the rhythm that tied it all together. It was as if she had been preparing her entire life for this moment, not just the past few weeks. Every lesson from the past, every memory, every ounce of effort had led to this point. For the first time in years, she felt completely at peace with herself. She was ready, not perfect, not flawless, but ready. Ready to face the music, ready to face the teachers, ready to show the world the quiet strength that had always been inside her. And in that readiness, there was power. There was courage. There was the understanding that sometime. The morning of the audition arrived with a strange mix of excitement and calm. She woke early, the sunlight spilling gently across her small bedroom. Normally, mornings brought a rush of nerves and hesitation, but today she felt something different. A quiet confidence hummed beneath the surface, a steady reassurance that she was ready. Her hands, which had trembled weeks before, now felt steady. Her heart, which had raced with doubt, now beat in a rhythm that seemed to match the music she had practiced so diligently. She dressed simply, wearing the same comfortable clothes she always wore, nothing flashy or attention-grabbing. She didn't need them. Today wasn't about appearances. It was about what she could create with her own hands and the instrument before her. Her mother, noticing her daughter's unusual calm, gave a small, encouraging smile, but said nothing. She had learned by now that this was not a moment for words, it was a moment for focus, for quiet preparation, for belief in oneself. Walking into the school music room, she was met with the familiar sights and sounds she had observed from the back of the class. The other students were already there, warming up, chatting, adjusting their instruments. Some glanced at her with curiosity, some with skepticism. After all, she was the quiet girl who no one had seen take bold steps before. A few whispered, wondering if she would even manage to finish the piece without stumbling. She ignored them, keeping her gaze steady, her attention fixed on the piano at the front of the room. The teachers were waiting, their expressions unreadable but attentive. They had expected nervousness, perhaps even a shaky performance. This was their impossible challenge, a piece they believed few students could master. But as she approached the piano, carrying her sheet music with careful hands, something about her presence caught their attention. She moved with purpose, yet there was a softness in her expression that suggested she wasn't performing for them. She was performing for the music itself. She arranged the sheet music on the stand, took a deep breath, and sat down. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, sensing the instrument, feeling the familiar resistance of the piano beneath her touch. The room grew quiet, the other students stopping their chatter as they sensed the seriousness of the moment. Even the teachers leaned slightly forward. Curious to see what would happen, she began slowly, letting the first notes fill the room. There was no hesitation, no fumbling, no doubt. The music flowed from her fingers like a river finding its way to the sea. Each note was precise, each phrase full of emotion, each pause deliberate. She wasn't just playing the music, she was living it, breathing it, telling a story that had been waiting inside her for years. The teachers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to astonishment. They had expected a student struggling to meet the challenge, but instead, they were hearing something extraordinary. The piece was difficult, demanding technical skill and emotional depth simultaneously, yet she played it with grace, precision, and a subtle power that was impossible to ignore. Even the other students stopped whispering, their eyes widening as they realized that the quiet girl they had underestimated was performing like someone far beyond their age and experience. As she continued, she allowed herself to feel the memories that had shaped her. Her grandfather's voice, his guidance, his patience, they were all there in every note. She didn't try to imitate him. She simply allowed the lessons he had taught her to flow naturally. The music became a conversation, a dialogue between her past, her present, and the potential of the future. She had spent weeks, maybe even months, preparing for this moment, and it was all coming together now. Flawlessly, yet effortlessly. There were moments when the piece demanded more than technical skill, it demanded heart. A delicate passage required subtle expression, a quiet vulnerability that could easily be overlooked or rushed. She leaned into it, letting the emotion rise and fall naturally. Every sound she produced carried weight, every pause told a story. The room seemed to hold its breath as she played, captivated not just by her skill, but by the depth of feeling she conveyed. By the time she reached the climactic sections, her fingers were moving with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost impossible. She wasn't rushing. She was in perfect control. The music soared, filling every corner of the room, yet it never felt forced or mechanical. She added small touches of her own, subtle improvisations that enhanced the original piece without overshadowing it. It was clear that she had not only mastered the notes but had made the music her own. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. No one moved, no one spoke. The teachers stared, mouths slightly open, eyes wide with disbelief. The other students, who had been skeptical just moments before, looked on in awe. The quiet girl who had seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, had just delivered a performance that none of them would forget. One of the teachers finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. That was extraordinary. He looked at his colleague, who nodded slowly, still processing what they had just witnessed. I don't think we've ever heard anything like that from a student this age, he added. Shaking his head slightly, she remained seated, her hands resting gently on the keys, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. She wasn't seeking praise, and she didn't need it. The music had spoken for her. She had shared something personal, something profound, and that was enough. Yet she couldn't deny the warm, quiet satisfaction that came with knowing she had met the challenge, not for anyone else, but for herself and the memory of her grandfather who had taught her to believe in her own voice. The other students slowly approached, their expressions a mix of admiration and disbelief. Some whispered words of congratulations, others simply nodded, unsure of what to say. The room, once filled with casual chatter and skepticism, now buzzed with a new energy, a sense of respect for the girl who had played not to impress, but to express. Her mother, who had come to watch quietly from the back of the room, felt tears prick her eyes. She had always known her daughter was talented, but seeing it in action like this was something different entirely. The quiet confidence, the precision, the emotional depth, it was more than she had ever imagined. She realized that the music had been a source of strength, a place where her daughter could be fully herself. And this performance was a testament to the hours of dedication, practice, and quiet perseverance that had led to this moment. As the applause began, she rose slowly from the piano, bowing slightly, not out of pride, but out of respect for the music. The teachers approached, their expressions now a mixture of amazement and pride. They told her that they had never expected such a performance, that she had surpassed every expectation, and that she belonged in the advanced group not only because of her technical skill, but because of the passion and depth she brought to every note. She listened quietly, a soft smile on her face, feeling a sense of calm and fulfillment that she had never experienced before. This wasn't just about being accepted into a group or proving a point. This was about acknowledging her own abilities, embracing her own story, and stepping into a space where she could be fully herself. The music had allowed her to communicate something deeper than words ever could. And that was the true triumph of the day, even after the teachers had spoken, and the other students had offered their congratulations. She remained composed. She packed her sheet music carefully, feeling a sense of closure and accomplishment. The challenge that had seemed impossible weeks ago had been met with grace, focus, and heart. She had faced it not with arrogance but with determination, and had emerged stronger, more confident, and more connected to the music that had always been a part of her. Walking home that day, the sunlight felt warmer, the air lighter. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the quiet days of practice in a small apartment to the moment she had sat before her teachers and shared her gift with the world. She realized that the true reward wasn't the praise, the recognition, or the acceptance into the advanced group. The reward was in the music itself, in the ability to express what she felt, to honor the memory of her grandfather, and to finally claim her place in a world that had often seemed too big, too loud, and too uncertain. That evening, she returned to her apartment and sat at the keyboard once more. She played not because anyone was watching, not because she had to, but because it was who she was. The notes flowed freely, effortlessly, carrying with them the story of the quiet girl who had faced an impossible challenge and had emerged not just victorious, but transformed. In that moment, she understood something important. Challenges weren't just tests of skill, they were opportunities to grow, to discover and to connect with something greater than oneself. The impossible challenge that had once loomed over her had been a doorway, and she had stepped through it with courage, focus, and heart. And as the music filled the room, she felt the quiet strength that had always been inside her, now fully realized, guiding her forward into a future full of possibility, promise, and the knowledge that she had the power to face any challenge that came her way. The weeks following the audition passed quickly, but in a way they felt like a turning point in her life. The days at school became less about worrying over her place in the class and more about focusing on what she had learned from her performance, the challenge, the growth, and the strength she had discovered within herself. The teachers had been kind, of course. They offered their congratulations, but something had changed in her. The moment she had played that piece, something inside her had shifted. She realized it wasn't about proving herself anymore. It was about embracing who she was and finding the confidence to share that with others. She had learned so much in those few moments at the piano, more than any grade or award could ever teach her. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of belonging, not because others saw her potential, but because she had learned to see it in herself. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was someone who could stand tall, proud of what she had accomplished, and even more proud of who she had become in the process. The school year carried on, and the other students, though still whispering in the hallways, began to treat her with a newfound respect. The whispers weren't about skepticism anymore, they were filled with admiration. They had seen her quiet strength, and now they recognized that she wasn't just another student in the back of the class. She was someone who had the courage to step up when the challenge seemed impossible. And it wasn't just about the music. It was about everything she had quietly endured to get to this point: the uncertainty, the doubts, the fears, and how, in the end, she had overcome them all. As the days grew longer and the school year neared its end, her confidence deepened. She no longer sat quietly in the back of the room, hoping to blend in with the crowd. Instead, she participated more in class, asking questions, offering her thoughts, and even occasionally sharing her experiences. She realized she had a voice, one that was worth listening to. And slowly, bit by bit, she allowed that voice to grow, first in the music room and then outside of it. Her mother noticed the change, of course. She'd always been proud of her daughter, but now there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She no longer had to remind her daughter to practice, to study, or to keep moving forward. The quiet girl who had once doubted herself now faced each new day with a sense of purpose and determination. And every time her mother saw her sitting at the piano, her fingers flying across the keys, she was reminded of the journey they had both been on. The quiet girl had found her voice, and in doing so, she had given her mother the greatest gift of all, the gift of belief. But the real change wasn't just in how she carried herself or how others saw her. It was in the way she approached music itself. She realized that the piece she had played for the audition wasn't the end of her journey, it had been the beginning. The music had always been there, a constant thread running through her life. But now it wasn't just something she played. It was something she lived. Every note, every phrase, every pause had become a part of her story, not just as a musician, but as a person. She no longer played to please anyone else, to meet their expectations, or to fit into their mold. She played for herself, for the joy of it, for the freedom it gave her to express what she felt deep inside. Her practice sessions became a form of self-expression, a place where she could experiment, make mistakes, and try new things. She no longer felt the need to stick strictly to the notes on the page. Sometimes she would improvise, letting her fingers wander across the keys, exploring new rhythms and melodies. Other times she would play an old piece in a new way, slowing it down to savor the quiet moments or speeding it up to feel the rush of energy. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about feeling the music, letting it shape her emotions, and expressing something true and personal. One afternoon, as she was playing an old melody her grandfather had once taught her, she paused, a bittersweet feeling washing over her. She hadn't realized how much she missed him until that moment, how much of him still lived in the music they had shared. But rather than feeling sad, she felt something else: gratitude. She realized that, through the music, he would always be with her. Every note she played was a connection to him, to the lessons he had taught her, and to the love he had shown her when he had believed in her before anyone else. The days turned into weeks, and before long it was time for the end-of-year concert. The students were all preparing their pieces, excited and nervous for the performance. She hadn't planned on participating at first. She didn't feel the need to prove herself again, and the thought of standing on stage in front of everyone felt daunting. But as the concert day drew closer, something shifted inside her. She realized that she didn't need to perform to prove anything to anyone. She didn't need to play for validation or applause. She simply wanted to share the music, to let others experience what she had found: joy, freedom, and connection in every note. The night of the concert, she sat backstage, quietly waiting her turn. The nerves had returned, but they were different now. They didn't feel like fear. They felt like excitement, like anticipation. This time, she wasn't afraid to be seen. She wasn't worried about making mistakes or messing up. She was simply ready to play, to share the music that had been her companion for so long. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage with a steady breath, her heart beating calmly in her chest. The audience was waiting, the room silent, expectant. She sat at the piano, adjusted the sheet music in front of her, and placed her hands on the keys. The world around her faded as the first notes filled the air. There was no hesitation this time. The music flowed from her fingers, warm and sure, like a river that had finally found its path. As she played, she felt a deep sense of peace, as though every part of her every lesson, every struggle, every moment of doubt had led to this. The music was no longer just notes on a page. It was a conversation between her and the world, between her past and her future. The room was silent as the audience watched, not just hearing the music, but feeling it too. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was hers, and that was enough. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, but she didn't hear it at first. She was too busy savoring the feeling of having shared something true, something meaningful. She had played not for approval or recognition, but for the joy of the music itself, for the joy of being herself. Fully and completely after the concert, the teachers came up to her once again, offering their congratulations. But this time, their praise felt different. They weren't just recognizing her technical ability, they were recognizing her heart. They saw her for who she had become, and that was more valuable than any performance score or award. As she walked off the stage, she felt a sense of completion, but also of anticipation. She knew this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning of something bigger. She had faced her fears, embraced her talent, and connected with the music in a way she never had before. And now, she was ready to see where it would take her next. At home that night, she sat at the piano again, her fingers dancing across the keys as she played for herself, for the quiet joy that music brought her. She realized that, in the end, this journey had never been about a specific goal, an audition, or a performance. It had always been about finding her own voice, learning to believe in herself, and sharing the music that had been inside her all along. And as the notes filled the room, she knew that the music would always be a part of her, a way to express what words could never capture, a way to connect with herself and others in a deeper, more meaningful way. The impossible challenge had turned into a beautiful opportunity, one that had changed her forever. And now she was ready for whatever came next, knowing that with every note she played, she was telling her own story, and it was a story worth sharing.